Welcome to The Founder's Mind. This is your host, Adam Muchler. On this episode, I have John Zeratsky, a Google alum and New York Times bestselling author of Sprint, and most recently, author of Make Time, a book about creating time for what matters by rethinking the defaults of constant busyness and distraction. In an age where we're constantly being pulled in many directions, John dives into how we can make time and find ourselves in more control of our days, weeks, months, and with practice, years. Listen and learn all about what John has discovered through practice and research and how you can make time in your daily life. John, thanks for joining me on The Founder's Mind.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited.
I've got a copy of Make Time here, and I've been doing some light reading, if you will, and sort of checking you out on the internet and seeing this incredible body of work that you've built around how we spend our time, and with your co-author Jake. And I'd love to hear a little bit from you, from your perspective, about the book and about the focus of the book.
Yeah, so Make Time is a book for busy, distracted people who want to take control of their energy and their attention so that they can actually make time for the things that are important to them. It's something that Jake and I have struggled with. We both worked in the tech industry, which, in addition to giving us a pretty unique view behind the scenes of how some of these really addicting and distracting technologies are made, we were also in a corporate environment, sort of a corporate culture that can be pretty intense. There's an expectation that you're always online, you're always responsive, you're in back-to-back meetings. And we loved our work, but we had other things that we wanted to make time for. So this book is the culmination of about 10 years of experiments trying to solve that problem.
That's amazing. And in a quick Google search will really pull up a lot of the work that you've already done, pre-launch of the book, the newsletter, Time Dorks. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah. Time Dorks.
And all these little experiments. And there was even a little excerpt from, I think 2012, there was a comment about how distracting your phone was and trying to spend time away from your phone. And I worked at Apple for 7 years, and I like to follow along with what Apple's putting out software-wise. And it's really interesting. It's 2018, and there's a big emphasis in this new update coming out this year around reducing distractions, analyzing how much time you spend on your screen. I'd love to hear. I'm very curious about your sort of perspective on that.
Yeah, you're right that is a big focus now, and it's awesome. It's really cool to see tech companies prioritizing that. I think there has been some pressure. There's been a lot of op-eds and blog posts and that kind of stuff, basically pointing out how serious this problem is and trying to influence tech companies to do something about it. And so I think it's really encouraging. But I also feel like ultimately the responsibility needs to fall back on the individual because, the incentive structure for Google and for Facebook and for Apple, that hasn't changed. I don't think that there's any malicious intent. I worked in technology, and I think 99% of the people really just care about making things that make the world better, that improve people's lives.
Yeah.
But the incentives still are that those companies succeed when people use their products more. So I feel like nobody cares more about my time than I do. And so if I want to find ways to spend less time on sort of those mindless distractions, those kinds of things where starts with a quick check and turns into 30 minutes, then that needs to be something that I make a priority. And that's kind of the perspective of Make Time, is that we're not trying to pressure the industry to change. There's other people who are sort of
focusing on that
baton. Yeah. But our focus is really on helping people just rethink the defaults in their life so that they can make time.
No, I love that. And with the previous book, Sprint, and with some of the bio information that comes up for you, there's this, there's a storyline of the amount of startups that you've worked with and the industry that you've immersed yourself in. Where do you see this body of work sort of aligning with founders, early stage founders, or even people that have been in it for years and are experiencing serious burnout?
Yeah, I gave a talk earlier this week at a conference in Madison, Wisconsin, and most of the audience was founders, leaders of teams, managers, that sort of thing. And I feel like that's such an interesting opportunity for me. And a lot of the work, as you pointed out, a lot of work that I did when I was working in technology was actually with startup founders. So I was at Google Ventures for about 6 years, which is the VC firm that's funded by Google. And my job was to go and actually work with the companies that we had invested in, sort of as a consultant. My background's in design. So I would go in and help them figure out how to use design to reach whatever their goals were as a business. And the cool thing about founders is that these changes in the way that they spend their time and the decisions they make about their time and energy, they not only have a direct effect on their ability to be good leaders. If somebody's feeling burned out, feeling like they have to constantly be busy, they have to be filling every minute, thinking more intentionally and proactively about this stuff allows them to step back and find a little bit more clarity. But it also affects everybody they work with. Mm-hmm. If a leader calls a meeting every time they need an update on a project, or if they expect immediate responses, or if they decide to layer on, 5 different platforms for communicating and staying in touch and project management, then it becomes a team who's doing work about work instead of doing the actual work. And so I love talking with founders and leaders about this stuff because the opportunity is just so huge for them.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. And so the work that I get paid to do, outside of the podcast, which isn't a paid gig yet, is I do executive coaching and leadership development with startups, and I'm in DC, so also, with federal government agencies and things like that. Mm-hmm. But one of the, you just said it, one of the things that I love about that work with founders is that learning can be applied so quickly, and that the level of impact, because of how fast things are moving, can be far greater, because they might make a nuanced shift to their, so let's say how they look at their day, how they look at their team, how they look at the language that they're using. And the impact is almost immediate.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that was a lot of the lessons that Jake and I took away from our work in the tech industry that influenced Make Time were based on running these design sprints. And the design sprint is it's a 5-day process for teams to take an idea from sort of just abstract notion to concrete prototype that they can put in front of customers. And that was exactly like you're saying. It's such a rapid way to try things and see how they go and make changes, that we basically had this really interesting laboratory where every week we could sort of experiment with the defaults about how people spend their time and see what worked. And that was such an amazing learning experience for us. And I can imagine, for you, that's like what you're doing all the time. You're living in this laboratory every week, it sounds like.
Yeah, no, at least in the conversations that I have with clients, it's actually very energizing to just see things get put into action.
Yeah.
You brought up sprints, and I know I mentioned it earlier. I'm curious, with Make Time coming out, and obviously with this body of work sprint that's been around for a little while now, if you were to read the books in order, what order would you suggest?
That is an interesting question. I don't know that it matters a ton. I think it would depend on who you are. I think it depends on kind of where you're at. So I think that in many ways, sprint is more approachable, even though it requires like a whole week and a whole team to make it happen. Mm-hmm. It's more approachable because it doesn't get at the core of you and how you spend your time. You can read it and you can think like, yeah, we should do that at work. That'd be awesome. And you can go and you can talk to your boss about it. And, the whole thing can kind of stay at arm's length until you do it. And then it's, the amazing thing about sprints is that teams have by deciding to do a sprint, they have this unique opportunity to spend time focused on their work in a way that they never ever get to do. But make time is really about what we do every day as individuals. And we always say that people, they have to want to change. The book is not an intervention. I think if you don't already have some motivation, that, you don't already have this feeling that, I never quite seem to have the time for the things that I want to do. I've got these someday projects, these ideas, but I never quite, someday never quite arrives. If you're not already thinking about that, I think that make time might feel a little bit challenging, too challenging. So I think it really depends on the individual.
I think it's a great answer. It sounds a little political, but it's not politics, so it's okay.
Yeah, I suppose everything is being. You're in DC, right?
Yeah, I can't help it.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe you see things through that lens.
That lens, yeah. I love having conversations like this and diving into topics like this. And I'm even reflecting on my day yesterday, and I was like, man, I did not control my time yesterday, and it was a tough day for me. Not catastrophic, but I was exhausted and I was beaten. I was frustrated a lot because I was constantly chasing these commitments or these things that didn't allow me to move in a sort of methodical way or in a thoughtful way. And I can just see the application for people and teams. And I'm wondering, any anecdotes? I know you said you've been sort of thinking about this for 10 years, or honing your focus. Any anecdotes with any companies you've worked with or with teams that you've worked with around make time?
I don't know that I necessarily have any that are specifically about make time. A lot of the experiences working with teams have more to do with design sprints, which have a similar philosophy. This idea of changing defaults. So, whereas the default approach, the business as usual approach, is to spend most of your time in meetings, and then when you're not in meetings, you're trying to stay on top of your email, and then any real work you have to do kind of gets squeezed in around the edges or in the gaps in between meetings. And design sprints, very much like make time, are a system for resetting those defaults. So allowing teams to have time to focus instead of fragmented time, to work face to face instead of trying to push things forward via email and instant messaging. And the idea of doing one thing at a time rather than trying to do everything at the same time. And so in that sense, I think...
Are you telling me that multitasking isn't real?
I'm afraid that's the case. It was really just like switching back and forth super fast, which is, when you think of it that way, it just sounds depressing.
Intense.
But so I guess looking at it through that lens, I'm just sort of thinking out loud here. The sprint experiences are the same as the make time experiences. It's just doing them on an individual level versus doing them on a team level.
Sure. Yeah. If you're looking at sprint, if you're looking at the 5 days and bringing people together, what are those? And then you zoom in, you say, what are the tactics? And you start looking at some of these tactics and make time, like nixing notifications, right? I'm sure that there are certain moments in the sprint process where notifications would ruin or destroy progress.
Yeah, that's actually so important that we don't even allow people to use devices in a design sprint.
See,
there are moments when we have to, but for the most part, if you have to look at your phone or look at your computer, we encourage folks to step out of the room.
I appreciate that in general for a lot of reasons. I have my own relationship with phones and my own relationship with people and their technology, like how I see it. Something that I think is kind of interesting, and it's related to timing a little bit, but this book is coming out in the near future. The podcast, I don't know when the episode will air, so either before or right after. But Daniel Pink wrote a book called When, and it came out this year.
You were the second person this week to mention that book to me.
I mean, I feel like it's relevant. I think they're very different focuses once you start digging into Make Time, at least in my opinion. Make Time is really about what can I as an individual do, and how do I cut through, the distractions and the pulls on my time. And Daniel Pink's book, When, is, a little bit more meta, and what's the research behind sort of the best time of day to do things. And he's pulled in some very interesting studies. I don't know if you've had a chance to read the book, but any thoughts on the relationship to sort of starting to focus on time as an important aspect in 2018, or it's sort of this time of society?
Yeah, I as we talked about earlier, things have just been getting crazier and crazier. The whole the smartphone thing, just social media in general, which pushes so many buttons for us as humans. Our innate distractibility, our love of gossip and wanting to know what other humans are up to. These are all things that we evolved over hundreds of thousands of years, and so I think explain a lot about why we feel the way we do when we use smartphones and when we use social media. But one thing I've been thinking a lot about lately is how the situation that, the world that we live in today in 2018, with Trump in the White House, with a constant stream of news that is really troubling to a lot of people, really challenging. It's kind of that train wreck metaphor. It's so bad, but you can't look away. Which has led to a lot of energy and a lot of enthusiasm from people who want to do something, people who want to become politically involved or civically engaged in a way that they haven't done before. Mm-hmm. And I think that has driven even more attention toward the news, toward the breaking news, which is really not that different from social media or from YouTube videos or whatever, in terms of how it can affect our
the psychology behind it is similar.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, everything from sort of the notification to the story about what another person is doing, that feedback loop of then feeling like what's going on. And so, that makes you feel good. So you're primed when the next notification appears. So I think, there's obviously a lot of forces, but one thing that is very unique to 2018 is just how our politics, our government, our news, our devices have all been swirled together into not just something that's distracting, but something that feels like we really need to pay attention, something that feels like a responsibility.
Yeah. And this idea that everything is breaking. Every time I turn on the news, it says breaking. I don't think I've seen a news clip recently that hasn't said breaking, which starts to make me ask the question, do we need another term? Like super breaking, extreme breaking,
right,
what's going on? But in one of the pieces that I read from your work is this idea of, I don't know if it was a practice that you took on or that Jake took on, but reading the news once a week.
Yeah, that's something I've been doing for a few years. I actually studied journalism at University of Wisconsin. I studied journalism and I worked at a newspaper in college. So I've always really felt like the news was important, and it is important. And for a long time, I struggled with how much time to spend on it. And until recently, it wasn't all that challenging because the typical formats were the newspaper. And even if I was reading the news online, the newspaper, they would sort of update the website once a day. And before smartphones, there was no ability for news providers to interrupt you with new stories, that ubiquitous breaking news that we were just talking about. But I felt like it got to the point where I would spend time reading the news and then I would feel bad about it. I would feel regret that I had sunk that much time into something that I wanted to, I cared about. I wanted to spend time on it, but it didn't have a direct impact on my day-to-day life. And it was the time that I was spending on it was disproportionate to what I could actually do about it. So I started experimenting with a few different ways of dialing that back. And my mantra for this stuff is always to take willpower out of the equation. So
to take willpower out of the equation.
Yeah. To make, to create barriers to distraction. So, whether it's apps or websites, whether it's the news, social media, games, designers like me have spent decades making this stuff as smooth and as frictionless as possible. So when I'm looking for a way to reset one of my defaults, for example, with the news, I'm looking for ways to make it more difficult to get sucked into that infinity pool. That's what I call these sort of infinitely refreshing and replenishing sources of content. So what I came up with the news was to remove any news apps from my phone. I have a Google Pixel, and it has like if you open the Google search box, it has like a default feed of stories that it thinks you should read. So I turned that off. I logged out of we pay for a few newspapers because as journalism students and former journalists, we do want to support news organizations. I think that the work that they're doing is really important, but I log out of those sites so that I can't sort of mindlessly click through. And instead I subscribed to The Economist, which is a weekly magazine that does a really, really good job of covering all the really important stories around the world, but in the US as well. And so that combination of different tweaks and sort of defaults that I changed meant that I'm not spending time throughout the day checking up on the news, but instead I'm getting a really nice summary, really thorough coverage of everything that's important at the end of the week.
I really appreciate that approach and that breakdown. Also, all the little things that you can do to, again, this goes back to earlier in the conversation, to create a bigger impact in your life, right? It's a bunch of little steps and a bunch of thoughtful decisions around how do you engage, or how do I engage, if it's me, with a distraction. So let's call it the news. How are you engaging with a distraction, and how can you change that engagement? I like it.
Cool. What's your news habit? How do you read the news?
Oh God, it's so unhealthy. I'm at the early stages of where you found yourself and have moved on from. I saw Van Jones speak, and he made a comment about he's like, liberals wake up every morning and they see the headline on their phone and they scream and shout. And then they do the same thing the next morning. And he's like, that is literally the definition of crazy. And when this was like several months ago, and when he said that, I was like, oh my gosh, that's me.
Yeah. I heard an interview with Eric Garcetti, who's the mayor of Los Angeles. And he made a very similar point. He was like, the people that I know, friends, they spend their entire day, it seems like, just, getting worked up, getting outraged, getting upset. But his advice is to spend 10 minutes yelling at the news, get it out of your system, and then figure out how you can spend your time to do the work that's going to, make things better for yourself, for people around you, for the world, whatever's important to you.
Yeah. No, I think the content of this book and the work that you're talking about and these distractions are so important, because one of the things that we say, and I'm using we intentionally here, is I don't have time. Oh, I can't get there. I can't do this. I don't have time. But then when you start to look at all the things that you do, and there might be big things, right? Oh, I have this thing I do in the evening. I meet up with some people. It happens every week. Or I'm coaching high school soccer this fall. Those are serious things that take up time.
Yeah.
But then there's this like, how much time do you actually spend on Instagram in a day?
Right.
And you're like, should I spend an hour on Instagram?
Yeah. There are some amazing stats about that stuff. On average, Americans spend about 4 hours a day using their phones, their smartphones.
That's what iOS 12. I've got the beta. That's what it tells me on my phone, and I was
Okay.
devastated. I saw that and I was like, oh, I was like between 4 and 5 hours, and I was like,
Yeah, seriously. And you figure that some of that time is well spent. Some of that time is things that you want to be doing or
sure,
things that are
sure,
important to do, work, whatever. But probably not all of it. And then at the same
definitely.
time, and this is a decades long pattern. Americans on average spend about 4 hours a day watching TV too. So
Yeah, of
you add those together, and I know we're talking averages here, so it's not exactly
course.
sound math, but you add that 4 plus 4, distraction is practically a full-time job for a lot of Americans these days. And so I think when you do, install, iOS 12 and you see those numbers, or you install an app like Moment that tracks how you're using your time, and you realize just how it adds up, I think most people have this realization that that's not what they want to be doing.
Yeah,
It was okay in the moment. It seemed fine in the moment. But when you look at it all together, you think about what you could be using that time for, you realize that you have a lot more control over your time and a lot more influence over the ways that you spend your time during the day than you might initially realize.
no, I mean, I totally agree, and I find myself saying that with guests a lot. But I happen to be talking to, I think, people that are focusing on interesting things, and what just that comment made me think about is this idea, of being on autopilot or being in the driver's seat, and how much of our society and life and the world puts us in autopilot. And part of it is I think that making decisions and change is uncomfortable for a lot of people, but mostly because we don't practice it. And the longer we don't practice it, the more and more uncomfortable it becomes. And the older we get, the harder it gets to break that cycle.
Yeah, that's true. There are so many defaults that influence the ways that we spend our time. And for anyone listening who's not familiar with that term, default is basically like, in sort of in technology lingo, it's just the way that something works, unless you go out of your way to change it. So, obviously our phones have tons of defaults that are not optimized for, the ways that we want to be spending our time. By default, you've got email installed on your phone. By default, the phone's going to automatically check for email. It's going to show you a notification when you've got a new message. By default, most phones have infinity pool apps like the news and stock market and videos, YouTube maybe installed.
And infinity pool in this context is sort of something that sucks you in and keeps you there.
Yeah, infinity pool is a term that I use to basically describe any source of endlessly replenishing content. So it could be an app, could be a website. If you can pull to refresh it, or if it streams, or if there's an infinite kind of body of information and you feel yourself getting sucked into it, then it's an infinity pool.
Gotcha.
But those defaults, they aren't just in our technology. There's a lot of really interesting cultural defaults. Like I mentioned earlier, how at the office there's sort of this default expectation that we're going to go from meeting to meeting to meeting, and then when we're not in meetings, we're going to stay on top of our email. There's an interesting default that other people can put meetings on our calendars. That's kind of crazy when you think about it. Or that meetings are always, it seems like, and I'm sure every company is different, but it seems like meetings are always 60 minutes or 30 minutes, even if you really just need like a quick chat, or even if maybe it would actually be better to spend 4 hours, actually having a working session instead of just a meeting. And some of these things are fine and some are not so fine, but it's really interesting to me that so much of it, like you said, is autopilot. It's stuff that we do without necessarily making a decision about. It's just the way it is.
Yeah. Well, and that's what I love about this book and other books that are coming out, for a while now, but we're talking about more. And I think people are looking at more. We're saying we are just cruising and we're not asking certain questions that aren't, huge questions. They're not, it's not like these tactics aren't major shifts, but we're not even looking at these little things that we could do to make a legitimate impact almost instantly. The change takes time, right? But like you will notice a change kind of quickly. Just whether or not you stick to it is another question.
Yeah, that's true. And we do try to, I think it's really important for people who want to experiment with changing this stuff that they look for ways that they can make an upfront decision that then becomes automatic. So things where they don't have to decide every day to keep doing it. A good example is removing an app from your phone. Even if you don't kind of go all in on the distraction-free phone, which is one of the tactics. But if you think about what your distraction kryptonite is, what's the one thing that you always seem to spend way more time in than you want to, and remove that from your phone, then it becomes kind of automatic, because the next day you don't have to think, all right, don't check Facebook, don't check Facebook, don't check Facebook. You go to your phone, you're like, oh, right, I don't have Facebook on my phone. So you've sort of broken that cycle. And that's kind of the sweet spot for the changes that I like to encourage people to make is relatively small things that are one-time upfront decisions where you make the decision and then they become automatic. You don't have to constantly use willpower, constantly use self-control to do the right things.
I think that's a great place to leave it. I mean, that's the soundbite.
All right, cool. Yeah, sounds good.
John, thank you so much for coming on the show, and I'm glad I caught you on land so we could have the conversation.
Yeah, me too. The Wi-Fi when we're on the boat, as you might imagine, is not top notch. Yeah, so very happy to have the chance to talk with you, Adam.
Absolutely. And what's Make Time is the name of the book, obviously. What's a great way for people who are listening to find you, to follow along? You're obviously focusing on a lot of really important topics right now, and I think are very tangible for people.
Yeah. So Make Time is out September 25th. The best way to see everything that I've got going on is at Time Dorks. So TIMEDORKS.com, timedorks.com. And that's my newsletter about experiments in time management. And ironically, I will also suggest that people follow me on Twitter, because although Twitter it can be an endless source of distraction, it's also where I like to post updates on what I'm doing, and more importantly, talk to people who are interested in trying some of these things themselves. My username there is Jazzer, Jazer at Twitter.
Excellent. Thank you so much, John. This has been a blast, and I'm looking forward to following along in your work. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Founder's Mind. Check back later this week for a tangent episode where John and I dive deeper into some of his findings, how he ditched societal norms to live on a boat with his wife, and beyond. To make sure you don't miss any awesome wisdom from guests and stay up to date on the most recent episodes of the show, be sure to visit thefoundersmind.com. You can also follow along on social at The Founder's Mind. Last but not least, thank you to Roy Matz for the music on this show and his dope editing skills that make The Founder's Mind possible. Until next time, take care.
Going through all of this insanity and try to bring new ideas, make them a reality. Illuminate in the thoughts, make it a priority to implement what you learn. What you get is what you be. In a world full of noise, hard to find that clarity to try to lead subtly, never full of vanity, and try to change something small or try to change humanity. Power forward through the dark, founder's mind is what you